Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tundra Buggy 1 live chat, complete with sparring polar bears just outside the window. So I'm just going to do a soft introduction here while we make sure that this microphone is working and that people can hear me okay. And if you guys can hear me okay, let me know. We are on the Tundra Buggy cam right now. You should be hearing a voice over top of the polar bears that we're watching just outside our window. We've got two big males out there doing something we called sparring. Sparring is kind of like a play fighting. It's pretty awesome to watch. For those of you that maybe have watched these bears in the past, we do think one of them might be our old friend Victor. So these are two large male polar bears. They're not fighting to hurt each other necessarily, though sometimes we do see blood get drawn and these sorts of things. In the spring, when these bears fight for mates, they fight hard and they can seriously injure themselves. But at this time of year, we do think that this is a bit more of a play type behavior. They're kind of sussing each other up, figuring each other out, assessing their strength compared to other bears. And these two have tussled a couple times today. Then they hung out together. Many of you watched for quite a while as these two hung out together. And they kind of play, lay down, play, lay down. Not that dissimilar to humans or our children. Pretty cool to watch. So again, I'm just going to make sure people can hear me. Let me know if you can. Awesome. Thanks, Bearberry. Cool. Okay. So this is just so fantastic that this is right outside Buggy 1. We do have the Tundra Buggy Lodge just over to our right. These boys are going to come right up to us. So I'm going to talk maybe slightly quieter because they are quite close. And we do try to lessen disturbance on them. They really don't seem very concerned with what we're doing right now at all. These are two very confident polar bears. They're both in good shape. We do have some special guests on board today that we're going to be talking to. And of course, it is Halloween. So happy Halloween, everybody. Now, if you can get a good look at that bear, if you could zoom in a little bit on the cam, thank you. Yeah, if we could zoom in on the one on the left just for a moment here, we want to see that scar on the face. So polar bears can be more difficult to tell apart than brown bears, but one of the ways we can kind of get a good look at them. All right, we think that's Victor. Very cool. So it can be really hard to tell these guys apart. Not quite like the brown bear migration, those cams where all the bears kind of come together to eat salmon and you really get to know them individually. These polar bears here where we are in Churchill, Manitoba are right in the midst of their migration right now. They're all kind of moving up to the coast, hanging out, and they're going to be out of here as soon as the Hudson Bay freezes over this fall or winter. And it can be a real transitory zone in here with bears coming and going. And they can really look quite similar to each other. But these scars that the males get from actual fighting in the spring are some clues that tell us about who's who. So even though there's many we don't know, sometimes we see a mark that is just so particular. And this guy on the left here on the cam, we can see that his face has that V-shaped scar, which many of you noticed last year, and he affectionately became known as Victor. Very, very cool. We've also noticed that our viewers have astute eyes and have seen a few other bears with distinguishing markings around. I love the bear who has been dubbed Crawford. I haven't actually seen that bear up close yet. We've kept an eye out. You have got some amazing screenshots that you've posted. What a neat marking, whether it's a mole or whatever it is. I hope to get a good look at that bear at some point, but we haven't seen it around today. So keep an eye out for those types of markings. Let us know if you notice things like that so we can kind of get to know our friends a little better, but there will be many bears that come and go, and we can't quite say who's who. It can also be quite hard to tell males and female bears apart, especially if they're younger. So a female can be hard to distinguish from a subadult male or a young male. Sometimes we do get a male that's just smaller. So we really do need to get up close or have very obvious clues to say for sure whether a polar bear is male or female. But one obvious way is to see a very, very large bear with what we we can also look at where they're peeing. So we can see hairs either out the front or out the back that have pee stains, and those are a good clue. And we see those with these bears here. And then scarring on the face is a good indication that it could be a male, especially major scars. So these two are buddies. We're not sure if they would be related. It could be unlikely, but again, we can't say for sure. There's a lot of things we still don't know about polar bears and how they hang out in this area and this sort of social behavior that we see. It's a real unique situation here in Churchill. So these bears do rely on sea ice for their long-term survival, but Hudson Bay melts in the summer, and these bears come on shore, and they're adapted to do that. And at this time of year, when it starts to cool down and they're waiting to get back on the ice, and actually even earlier than now, even in the summer, we do see groups hanging out kind of together. It's pretty cool. It's pretty special. There's not many places on the planet where you get to see groups of polar bears playing and hanging out together, and you can get so up close. Churchill is really a special place, and that's why we have polar bear cams across the tundra. So we are on Tundra Buggy 1. We are a mobile broadcasting studio. We drive this little kind of polar bear monster truck around the tundra with our camera looking for bears. We also have a stationary lodge on the tundra. It's high off the ground. It kind of looks like maybe a few train cars pieced together, but it's a gorgeous lodge right in the middle of polar bear country where we can watch the polar bears, while we're eating dinner and when we eat breakfast. And we've got a cam on each side of that lodge facing north and facing south. And then our two other polar bear cams are farther out east on what we call the Cape Churchill. And so we can't see those from here with the naked eye, but they are out there getting other views. So if you guys do have questions about polar bears, we have some great guests today. We're happy to answer any questions you want. We love talking about polar bears. So cool. I love it when the bears give us a show while we're chatting. We really appreciate it. Yeah, and it's like, so at this time of year, it's, it's kind of common for these bears to hang out, and these two just kind of seem like they're buds. It's pretty cool, so we're going to keep an eye on them. We've been hanging with them all morning. Pretty fun stuff, and we're going to kind of move on for a moment to the broad theme of the show, which really won't take all that long to talk about, but we just think it's really cool. Halloween in Churchill. What is it like living in the polar bear capital of the world and trick-or-treating on Halloween? Pretty unique situation. Kind of fun. So Churchill is pretty, it's an interesting place in October, at the end of October here. There are bears around. We are outside of town right now. We're at least, 30 kilometers outside of town? 30, 35? Yep. So we're east of town at the moment. But even farther closer to town, there will also maybe be polar bears. Churchill has a good amount of resources, especially compared to more northern communities. We're lucky that the province of Manitoba is very supportive of keeping, Churchill people and polar bears safe. There's funds. Churchill has the ability to put in place what is called the Polar Bear Alert Program, and that's under the Manitoba Department of Sustainable Development. And this program's been going on for decades now. It was launched, I believe, in the 80s. As partly in response to bears coming into town and getting killed. There was an open garbage dump back then in Churchill, and that drew bears in from all over. You guys know they have a great sense of smell. They're going to be attracted by food when they're on land. And there were just fewer tools those days to keep polar bears and people safe. So the Polar Bear Alert Program is really special. Nothing really like it in the world that we know of. And Polar Bear Alert patrols the area. There's zones around Churchill that are designated. There's a Zone 1, which is right at the town. Zone 2, Zone 3. And the officers that work for Polar Bear Alert, they will look at where a bear is and act accordingly depending on how close it is to town. And there are different kind of levels of what they can do to keep the bears out of town. They can just use vehicles. They can use cracker shells. They'll adjust their response accordingly. The idea is to not hurt the bear, to make it not think that Churchill's an acceptable place to go. We want bears to not associate Churchill with food or good smells. We want to keep them away. It's safer for the bear at the end of the day. You all know, I believe, or many of you do, that Churchill does have a polar bear holding facility. So if a bear does make it into Zone 1 or is causing problems, breaking into a cabin in the middle of downtown, which has happened, that bear does get moved into the facility where it could stay for up to about 28 days or so. And at that point, it will be flown far away from town and dropped off. If a bear happens to be in the holding facility and the ice comes in, the bear or bears would be released early. As soon as there's sea ice, that's where those bears want to be, so the holding facility can clear out and let the bears go out and do their hunting of seals. That's where the bears really want to be. They're only coming into town because they're kind of hungry and kind of bored, and it's important that we keep polar bears and people safe and separate. So on Halloween, of course, there are kids in Churchill, some wonderful kids in Churchill. There's a great school. There's about 165 students at the school so far. We got to make sure those kids get some chocolate and some candy. So there's some extra patrols. So Polar Bear Alert is always patrolling the town, especially in the fall. You know, they're driving around. People have a polar bear hotline number they can call in if they see a polar bear. So on Halloween, you get extra patrols out, extra people in town. They do a perimeter run. The helicopter company even helps patrol. They can fly up and look around town, make sure there's no bears hiding in rocks or anything. And the whole town kind of comes together to make sure the kids are going to get out there and get safe. One thing to note is that it's highly discouraged to dress up like a polar bear on Halloween in Churchill. That's not really an appropriate costume unless it's, pretty obviously not a real polar bear. So go as a polar bear anywhere else for Halloween except for Churchill. So if you guys have any questions, I see Cloud, thank you so much, is posting a picture of the polar bear holding facility. And that gorgeous mural was just painted on it a couple years ago as part of Seawalls. So you see the sleeping polar bear there by Cal Bertesky. Such a nice job. And there's, of course, more information on the Manitoba Sustainable Development website about the Polar Bear Alert program. Polar Bears International does not, of course, we're not part of Polar Bear Alert, but we think they're doing a great job. We consider them an important part of the town, and we like to just, talk about good management practices where we can. Now, it is important to note that many communities do have polar bears and also kids, but they don't have enough resources to have such a robust kind of system to keep the town safe. So there's a couple different things or tools that we can look at, but we do believe that this is going to be becoming an increasing problem. As we continue to see sea ice loss in Hudson Bay, we are going to see polar bears on land and for longer. And so we want to make sure that, both species are again, kept safe. So we have a couple of people on board we'd like to talk to about that. Maybe first, I would like to pass it over to Liam. Liam is part of Taking It Global, one of our main education partners at Polar Bears International. And Liam spends time in farther north communities. And in fact, right after he leaves Churchill in a couple days, he's going to head up to Rankin Inlet. And so he works with some students that live up there. So I just want to hear for a couple minutes from Liam about his perspectives on what it's like being a kid in the north.
Thanks, Lisa. As I was very curious about what it's like to have Halloween in a place where there's polar bears, I checked in with some of my friends who lived in Arviat, and they mentioned that up there in Arviat, it's not really considered safe to go trick-or-treating. And so instead of doing the regular kind of going door to door and knocking on doors in your costume, they have decided to have Halloween inside instead of outside. And so basically they've moved the entire celebration for the community into the community center. And so instead of, again, being outside where there is increased risk of contact with polar bears, they've decided that in order to keep everyone safe, they should try and keep everyone indoors. And so instead of being outside, they'll be inside, which sounds like it might be a bit warmer this time of year up in the north. But you also, I guess, miss out on some of the experiences that we would normally have of walking around and doing that regular trick-or-treating stuff. But it still seems like it would be a really fun time to be in that community and to get to dress up and play around and be somebody else. I guess if you're inside too, you could dress up as a polar bear as long as it wasn't too realistic. That's basically how that works. Where there's less resources and it's trickier to kind of organize, people have found different ways of adapting, similar to the ways that polar bears are adapting to the lack of sea ice. So they come into town, and in some places, humans are being a little bit displaced from some of the activities and things that they would normally do around this time of year. So yeah, it's really important that we work together to safeguard that sea ice so that we can continue to coexist and stay separate and stay safe.
Fantastically said, Liam. So we've got some great questions coming in. And then we're going to pop over and learn about another tool that we can potentially one day use to keep both animals, species safe. All right. How many in jail or in the holding facility at the moment? That's a great question. I'm not sure right at the moment. And actually, this is something that Cloud is great at. So Sustainable Development does post an update weekly on their bulletin board about how many polar bears are in the holding facility any given week, how many entered, how many left. Usually Cloud posts that about once a week because she does my job for me. Thank you so much, Cloud, as always. But we can try to pull that out for you, and I can also look it up. I know a few, well, actually, I can't quite remember how many there are right now, but I believe the upper capacity is in the mid to high 20s. There are a couple areas that they can house moms and cubs, though, of course, they do try to not have moms and cubs in there too often if they can, and they probably have a shorter stint. So we'll get information for you shortly on how many bears are currently in there. Have there been any polar bear attacks? There have been. In the last few years, Churchill has seen a couple incidents. There was an incident where a young woman was attacked and a man jumped in to save her, and he was attacked. Both lived. And there was another incident where a man was kind of cornered by a bear at Gypsy's restaurant. If anyone knows of Gypsy's, which unfortunately is no longer a standing structure, but we love Gypsy's Bakery. And the bear cornered the man kind of at the door, and he was able to flash his light and kind of spook the bear enough that he could get away. And that bear has been taken down south since then. So the bears that did those attacks are no longer hanging out in the population. We didn't see any attacks in Churchill this year so far that I personally know of. Unfortunately, there were a couple men that were killed up higher north than here over the summer, and that is just a really tragic situations on both occasions. And this is something that we definitely don't want to see more of. But hopefully in Churchill we won't. Polar Bear Alert is very much on top of things, but polar bears, they move fast, they're quiet, they can sneak in. Even when folks are looking around, you can absolutely miss a bear. I don't know how many times we've been rolling along in a Tundra Buggy thinking that we're all alone, and out pops a bear out of the willows, and we had absolutely no idea there was a polar bear in there. For such a large animal, you really think they would stick out more, but they can sure blend in. It's a neat but potentially dangerous trait that they have, and that's one of the reasons that Polar Bears International is supporting the potential development of a new tool. And thank you. I see Cloud just posted the updates for the Polar Bear Alert currently. Super appreciate that. So that was for October 22nd. So that means there should be an updated one in the next few days, hopefully. So I'm going to pass this off to first Greg, and then if Amy wants to chime in. So we have Dr. Greg Tiemann here from York University and his grad student Amy, who are both helping us work on a new radar project in Churchill. And I would love to have them tell you a little more about it because it's pretty cool stuff.
Thanks, Elisa. Yes, my name's Greg Tiemann. I'm from York University. I've been coming up to Churchill for about the last 15 years on and off. And on our theme of Halloween, maybe I'll just give a little bit of background on some of the work that's happened in Churchill over the last many years. So maybe sometimes when we think of Halloween, we think of candy, of course, and costumes, but mischief can also play an important role in Halloween celebrations, and polar bears in and around the Churchill area have been notoriously mischievous over that time, and people didn't always know how to respond to that kind of behavior. And it's taken, the last 40 to 50 years to really understand what drives polar bear behavior and how to ensure that people and bears can coexist safely in the Churchill area. So it really started back in the 1970s when Churchill was facing a really serious problem of having bears come into conflict with people, and that's when the exploratory aspects of moving bears around on the landscape, trying to move them out to more northern areas or back out to the sea ice, really started. And there have been various attractants around the community, including, open dumps that unfortunately attracted many bears over the years. And over that time, Churchill and Manitoba Conservation, Manitoba Sustainable Development has really come a long way and developed a really sophisticated means of identifying and discouraging and ultimately managing bears that potentially come into conflict with people. So they've really got a great handle on some of the more mischievous elements of polar bears. And one of the emerging technologies that we hope to use to, again, manage and mitigate polar bear human conflict is the use of compact surveillance radar, which is a military grade instrument that is a radar system designed to detect movement in a very sensitive way at close range, and has initially been developed for use by forward military units to detect potentially hostile entities, and we are developing that technology for use in identifying and detecting polar bear movement. So here we have 4 compact surveillance radar panels attached to the Tundra Buggy Lodge, and it is detecting polar bears as they move around the lodge. And we're using this location and tracking data to first develop the technology, iron out some of the kinks, and make sure it identifies and detects polar bears reliably, and then use it to study their behavior. How do they approach the buggies? What time of day do they approach the buggies? Can we identify some of the stimuli, whether it's weather conditions or various environmental conditions, that contribute to polar bears approaching the lodge, or how long they stay near the lodge? Ultimately, we hope to develop this method so that it can be deployed just about anywhere people need to know where polar bears are, whether it's an industrial site where you have waste disposal, or resource development, or a community. We have also deployed this instrument at the Churchill Community Complex to hopefully identify polar bears approaching town from the bay. And if we can get the technology sorted out and get everything up and running reliably, it could be a really powerful tool for helping polar bears and people coexist.
I've got a question for you from someone who clearly knows more about radar than me. And if we can't answer it, then I'm sure we can look it up later. I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, Greg. Does radar operate in MMW frequency band? What frequency? Does it have MTI tracking? Okay, we're going to get back to you. So one funny thing about today is that most of you are used to us chatting with BJ while we're on Buggy One. Now, BJ had to jet out of town for a special occasion, and he is not here right now, and he's probably the one that has the answer to your question. So I'm going to have to come back to that next time I get to chat to him. Excellent question, and so sorry that we do not have the answer. But we have a lot of other great questions that we can answer, luckily, right now. And this is a a really cool question, and I'll maybe give my perspective, but Greg might know more than myself. We also noticed this. We were eating dinner as this happened. So the other night, a couple bears were circling the lodge in ever-widening circles. So those that were paying attention in the evening to Lodge North and South and the Tundra Buggy cam that are all kind of in the same place, you were seeing a bear like circle around another bear, and we were watching that as we ate. Eventually, they came together and they played and played. So could the circling behavior have been them kind of feeling each other out to assess who it was so they would know if each other was a friendly or a safe bear? Potentially, it's so hard to say. It's kind of, in a way, can be similar to what you might see when you take your dog to a dog park. I think there is a bit of feeling out. There's a lot of smelling of each other. I think there's a lot of nonverbal cues, a lot of body posturing. And I do think the bear wants to know, like, hey, are you cool to play a little bit? How would I stack up against you? Will this work out? Will this be fun for both of us? There's a smaller male in the area that's kind of been circling the bigger guys. And it seems like he wants to hang out with the big boys, but he knows he could get a really good walloping if he tried because he is much smaller. So we've been kind of watching him do a similar behavior, but he hasn't been brave enough to really approach one of these boys yet. And he probably will keep just trying to learn how to be a big guy from afar. But it is kind of curious behavior. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think dogs are probably a pretty good model, and there's a lot going on between and among these animals that we don't appreciate. Certainly, a whole range of smell signals are being transmitted, but yeah, behavioral cues, body posture and movements, and even where they place their head in relation to their body is sending signals to each other, and you put that kind of interaction between animals in the context of the Tundra Buggy operation, where there's also lots of new sights and smells. It can be a fairly complex environment for these animals, and they're clearly responding to something here.
Yeah, we're pretty lucky we get to see such neat polar bear behavior from these buggies. It's one of the multiple reasons we bring special guests up to Churchill. Sometimes as polar bear researchers, you kind of feel like maybe you get stuck behind your computer quite a bit. Depending on what type of polar bear research you do, you might be looking through a microscope at hares. You may be in the field working with polar bears, but those polar bears, of course, when you're close to them, they would be tranquilized for a short period of time so you can take measurements and then get away, but leaving you both safe. So this is a unique opportunity to really kind of watch polar bears hang out with each other, interact. We're very grateful to be here and to be sharing this with you. So we've got some other great questions. I would love to answer Ms. Cermelli's classroom's questions. Thank you so much for having your class join today. How exciting. Happy Halloween to all of you. I hope you have a great evening trick-or-treating and enjoy your costumes. So what is the average lifespan of a polar bear? Well, females live longer than males in the wild. Females can live into their, mid-late 20s, sometimes early 30s. Males can live into their late teens, early 20s, maybe a little longer depending. Males, like we mentioned a little bit before, they fight quite seriously during mating season, and they can get pretty banged up. Takes some years off these boys. So the females do live a little longer. Now, of course, in captivity or in a zoo, we would see a polar bear live longer, because they have basically catered lunches every day. They're not fighting. They're a little more pampered, so they do live longer. And the record holder was actually from here, and she lived in Winnipeg, and her name was Debbie, and she lived to 42 years old, and her ashes are spread along the beach here, which is pretty special. So, polar bears have not a hugely long lifespan, but a good lifespan. And we would think it's so hard to say looking at these bears. It's impossible to say truly how old they are. But we could guess that they're maybe somewhere between 10 and 20, which is quite a range, but that's as best we're going to probably be able to do for you guys. Okay, more questions. This is a kind of cool question. Do you see interbreeding? So there is only one species of polar bear. There's no subspecies as of this point. Their closest relative is the brown bear. They evolved from a brown bear ancestor many tens of hundreds of thousands of years ago, probably. We don't quite know exactly when, but it was a long time ago. However, it is possible, yet very, very rare for them to interbreed. We did see this happen recently up in the high Canadian Arctic. There was a little patch of hybrids that arose kind of unexpectedly. There were a couple polar grizzly hybrids that were called growler bears, and then there were a couple hybrids that were 3/4 grizzly, 1/4 polar. And people were kind of wondering what's going on. Is this like the new thing? Are we going to see a lot more of these hybrids? And finally, the genetic workup was done on the bears. Turns out they're all traced back to one female polar bear who either had a thing for or just happened to come across a couple male brown bears in her lifetime and mated with them. And cubs from those litters were, of course, half and half. And then one of those cubs ended up over her lifetime mating with the same two brown bears. So her father and her stepfather, you heard that right. Pretty interesting situation. We probably won't see a lot more of that. We saw in the hybrids that they weren't exactly the most fit bear, we could say. So people kind of wonder, well, is it the new super bear? Is it going to be able to live in this new environment after climate change? And that's not really what we saw. So brown bears are so well adapted to a life on land. From their paws to their teeth to their digestive system, they are meant to be living on land, digging, in the dirt, eating berries and roots and whatever meat they can come across. Polar bears are so fully specialized for sea ice. From their furred paws to their sharp, sharp teeth to their digestive systems that really rely on marine mammal fat and blubber, they're an ice bear. When you combine the two, you kind of just get a bit of a messy bear. Not really sure what they're well suited for. We, of course, don't know a lot about these hybrids, so we can't say much because there's just such little sample size. There were really few opportunities to observe them in the wild and how they behaved. From what we saw of their biology, they weren't very well suited to either environment. But, we don't really think we're going to see many more of them, so we're not too concerned. Could be possible that we'll see a few more arise in different areas, but at this point we aren't expecting any sort of growler bear wave, and it is very, very likely that the species have interbred at least very occasionally throughout their entire history separately. In fact, there's a group of brown bears off the coast of Alaska that have mitochondria DNA that is more closely related to the polar bear. So that's kind of cool. So the species